Hello again, and welcome to the Big Q. I'm Tony LoPresti from Religious and Theological Studies, the department where we're always asking the big questions. With me today are two of my colleagues who are good at answering the big questions. To my right is Dr. Deborah Curtis from Sociology and Anthropology, and to her right is Dr. Craig Condella from the Philosophy Department. Craig, let me begin with you. We're just days away from the opening of the UN Conference on Global Climate Change. This is a gathering that's bringing together nations from across the world. Every nation, I believe, is coming. What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, there have been continual attempts, some bigger than others, and this seems to be one of these bigger conferences, where the nations of the world attempt to get together and come up with a unified policy to combat global warming and climate change. If I could say a word particularly about the United States, that we did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So there's a lot of anticipation about what the U.S. might commit to at this particular meeting, since we've been, quite frankly, rather disappointing, not only Kyoto, but also in 2009 in Copenhagen, which was the last kind of major global summit to deal with these issues. So in general, it's an attempt by nations of the world to come together, to come to a unified agreement about what measures might be taken to reduce carbon emissions and to basically combat global warming.
Now, you would think when it comes to saving the planet, we would all want to participate, we'd all want to, do our part. Why is it so difficult to get agreement?
Well, I think, I don't want to overly simplify it, but the two major players, I think, in the room that the rest of the world are concerned with are the United States and China. And what it basically comes down to is the United States saying, well, we'll sign off and agree to this if China does. Again, not to overly simplify it, but this is what it's come down to in the past. And China says, well, the United States do not hold themselves accountable to these, restrictions and limitations and building up their own industry and economy, so we should be allowed to do the same. So we end up walking away from the table. And the Kyoto Protocol was signed by, I think, 192 nations. Don't quote me on that, but it was around there. So a lot of nations did back and ratify it, but we didn't, China didn't, India didn't, and until those major players commit to this, the smaller nations of the world could do what they want, but it's not going to have the desired effect, right, of actually combating carbon emissions and global warming.
So it sounds like the big question here is to whether the United States and possibly China as well can sacrifice some of their short-term economic interests for the sake of the common good, for the sake of the world over the long term.
Right, and I think that the emphasis there on short term, because coming up with alternative energy sources, long term might be a better economic policy, right? That hopefully we're kind of coming around to this awareness anyway. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that certainly I'll be watching as we sort of go to the table with the rest of the nations of the world.
Now, several months ago, the Pope issued an encyclical called Laudato Si, very much focused on this issue and trying strategically, several months in advance to influence the conversation. Mm-hmm. And he wrote this from a point of view, he wasn't just addressing it to Catholics, but really to people around the globe from a variety of backgrounds and disciplines and interests. Now, Dr. Curtis, as an anthropologist, how do you approach the document? What's in there that you can relate to?
Well, what's in there that I can relate to is that there's a lot of overlap between environmental anthropologists and what the Pope is calling for. And what the Pope is calling for specifically is that indigenous people be called to the table to participate in the decision making and the planning process for strategies that will meet the environmental crisis. And meaningful strategies.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but indigenous people often are not the most powerful people who come to the table here.
Right.
So it sounds very much like the Pope has the interests of the little guy at mind when he makes that kind of a call.
Well, the little guys who are directly affected by climate change today. So, for instance, in the Pacific Ocean, there's a small place called Kiribati, and they've already begun to make arrangements to move their whole community to another island because of the increasing levels of the sea encroaching in their communities.
That's a huge, I don't know how you could understate how huge a change that requires if you're moving your whole community. It's not even moving to a different neighborhood. It's moving to a different island. Now, if people are called to make that radical a difference, what about the rest of us who typically live relatively comfortably and don't think on the global scale? What is the Pope and what is really the world calling for us to do or to change?
Well, I think what he's asking very clearly is for us to examine our lifestyles, and in particular, he's asking us to examine our consumption practices. How are our consumption practices, what we purchase, the houses that we live in, our own carbon footprints, how are we complicit in the suffering of other people by our lifestyles? And that's what he is encouraging us to look closely at.
Craig, do you think we're ready to do that?
I'd like to be optimistic about it, but one of the issues here, and the Pope is very careful about this in his encyclical to say, let's not just talk about population, because again, not to boil this down to the United States and China, but there's obviously an exploding population in China, but as the Pope emphasizes, it's more about resource use. So, depending on the numbers that you look at, if the entire world consumed at the rate that the average American does, we would need 4 worlds to support the world, right? That's a major sacrifice that individuals would have to make. And I think the easiest way to do it is not to think of it as a sacrifice. I think you have to think of it as something that's actually allowing you to live a fuller sort of life. And I think that that's something that Pope Francis is attempting to do in the encyclical, to say that connecting with nature and with other people has a richness to it that we've been losing. So I think that, as soon as we tell people they have to make changes, to sacrifice or give up things, I think they resist, right? So if we could possibly, I hate to say sell it, but sell it in a different way, that this actually opens up new types of experiences, it might be an easier sell to the American public, which has gotten used to this, very high standard of living that, might seem an imposition to try to do without.
Well, the challenges are certainly there, but the questions are immense here. What kind of a world do we want to create for ourselves and our children, and what sort of sacrifices are we willing to make for the sake of generations to come? Really big questions, and I thank you for sharing some of the answers that you have with us and all those who are watching. So thank you once again for joining us. Please come back for future episodes. And remember, the Religious and Theological Studies Department asks big questions, but all of us do, because the good life is not about living large, it's about asking the big questions.